I mean, all of this, I am a producer. I went into all of this. This is the story that we wanted to tell and the way we
Yeah.
wanted to tell it.
Poor Things is a 2023 feminist steampunk comedy film directed by arthouse auteur Yorgos Lanthimos and starring Emma Stone. Some people are saying it is perhaps the most misogynistic film ever made, but is it? Good evening, everyone. My name is Celeste de la Cabra. Welcome back to the channel. Before we get into the review, a couple disclaimers. The first is that there are going to be some discussions of sexual assault and that sort of thing. So if that kind of thing is upsetting to you, please proceed with caution. You should also know that I'm going to spoil the shit out of this film, so if you have not seen it and you care about that kind of thing, do me a favor and add this video to your watch later playlist and come back when you've seen the film. But if that sort of thing doesn't bother you, or you've already seen the film, then let's proceed. Before I get into it, if you are at all interested in in-depth discussions on cult and art house films, please go ahead and click the subscribe button, like the video, and leave me lovely comments to read, and share this with someone you think might find this valuable. If you want to support my work, there's also a link in the description for my Patreon page, whereby you'll earn access to extra videos, handwritten postcards, and more. Okay, so the thing that I saw that really made me want to discuss this was, unfortunately, some discourse that was going around on twitter.com. That's a joke about me dead naming Twitter, by the way. I think the tweet is pretty stupid, is pretty, not great, but let's just go ahead and start by reading it. We're grounded in the sort of discourse that has ensued. Quote, "This is the most misogynistic film I've seen. A perverse man kidnaps a suicidal woman, then transplants her brain, parentheses, without her consent, with the brain of her fetus. She's emancipated by having sex with lots of men, parentheses, yawn. This film is not avant-garde, it's glorified pedophilia." Okay, so some pretty hefty accusations being thrown at our boy Yorgos and the queen Emma Stone.
It's so rude.
All right, so first, right off the bat, I just want to make it clear that the person who tweeted this is a lawyer and not a film critic, not a media analyst. It's not their job to be having good takes on this sort of thing. They are just a person who saw a challenging, strange film and had a bad opinion about it. And I don't think that's a crime yet, so I want to just make that clear, that I'm not holding this person to the standards of the people that I will perhaps be discussing later in this video, and I don't want to shit on this person or direct like any kind of harassment their way. I really just wanted to use it as a jumping off point to discuss the ideas in the film. I think it's a good kind of distillation of a lot of the discomfort and criticism that I've seen of the film so far. So to make sure that we're all on the same page here, let's go ahead and do a, as brief as I could get it, relatively brief plot synopsis. So Godwin Baxter, played by Willem Dafoe, a Frankenstein-esque scientist, discovers the body of a pregnant woman named Victoria, who has just jumped from a bridge to her own death. She is pregnant, so Godwin decides to conduct an experiment on the link between the maturation of the body and of the brain. He replaces the brain of the woman with the brain of the fetus and names her Bella. She then seemingly functions as an adult with severe mental disabilities. Godwin then enlists medical student Max McCandles to aid him in documenting her mental progress. He falls in love with her, and Godwin arranges a marriage contract to be written such that he will permit the wedding under the condition that Max and Bella never leave the castle. A lawyer named Duncan Wedderburn arrives to draw up the contract, but he sees her vulnerable mental state and recently awakened sexuality and takes advantage of her. As her mental acumen progresses, she becomes more curious about the outside world and sees Duncan as her ticket to sexual and intellectual liberation. Godwin and Max attempt to stop her, but she promises to return and leaves. Duncan and Bella go on many travel adventures, but as her intelligence rapidly accelerates, she becomes harder to control. She makes friends, learns philosophy, and ultimately outgrows Duncan. She leaves him and enlists herself as a sex worker at a brothel in France, where she meets the socialist sex worker Toinette. When she hears that Godwin is dying, she visits him and learns of the experiment. She attempts to proceed with her marriage to Max, but Victoria's husband, Alfie, comes to claim her. She leaves with him to learn more of her previous life, but quickly learns why Victoria had felt the need to escape through death. She incapacitates him, takes him to Godwin's castle, and replaces his brain with that of a goat. Godwin dies and she decides to become a surgeon herself, living and studying in the castle with her cute polycule comprised of herself, Max, Toinette, and their pet goat man. So let's break down a few of the claims that the tweet makes as to the perceived problematic elements of the film. The first and most salacious claim, perhaps, is that the film is in itself pedophilic. Now, the early sex scenes in the film, they certainly feel uncomfortable, as she certainly doesn't fully understand what is happening, and the men taking advantage of her are absolutely guilty of some serious sexual misconduct, namely Duncan. Bella's character starts with the body of an adult, but the mind of an infant. She discovers masturbation and is quickly manipulated into sexual and possessive relationships with men. Duncan sees her mental handicaps and takes advantage of it to fuck her. Oh, that sounded aggressive. I don't like that. Max falls in love with her and attempts to enter an agreement to essentially keep her prisoner, and Godwin attempts to control her and keep her from ever leaving his castle. However, I don't agree that Bella continues to lack this understanding throughout the film. She very queerly, what the fuck? She very quickly progresses in her mental acuity, in her understanding of the world, and in her own agency. This is typified and externalized by how quickly her hair grows. Due to fantasy sci-fi mechanics of infant brain implants, or something, it doesn't really matter exactly how, she matures at an accelerated rate. This is clear in her language evolving, in her walk stabilizing, and in the books she reads. Now, it seems obvious to point out, but babies and children can't read or meaningfully comprehend moral philosophy and texts on ethics. The film only really remains pedophilic if you ignore these very obvious signs of accelerated maturity.
Oh God, there's so many.
Now, one might argue that portraying scenes like this is an act that is inherently pedophilic or problematic, sort of like the idea that portraying a rape or a torture scene might be inherently inappropriate regardless of the context or the messaging. Now, to be clear, I think this is a fine position to take when one is making a decision about the content that they are personally comfortable engaging with, but I don't believe it's a defensible one when that view is enforced on other viewers and on filmmakers in regards to what they should or should not be creating. We must understand that it is possible to depict bad things without endorsing them. Another objection one might have to the early sex scenes is on the grounds that they exist to titillate the viewer and to be enjoyed perhaps erotically or uncritically. I think this is a more subjective and honestly a more defensible position, but I still don't agree that that is the purpose of those scenes. Rather, I feel that they exist to make a comment on the ways in which men prey on vulnerable women, particularly at young ages. Now, this is all well and good, but I think at the end of the day, regardless of the literal mechanics of her physical versus mental age and when exactly it stops being pedophilic, and she gains her own agency and ability to consent, fundamentally we're dealing with a fantasy sci-fi film that largely deals in metaphor and symbolism. The visual effects, steampunk period setting, bizarre fantasy creatures, and cinematography are constantly telling us that what we are seeing is not grounded in the real world. There's not even a ton of effort made to explain the science of the procedure that allows Bella to become the person that she is. The audience is trusted to trust the story and characters and not get mired in the weeds of literalism. Bella represents a person completely uninhibited and untouched by the politeness and conventions of society. She is free to engage with the world honestly and pursue pleasure and autonomy without the baggage of religious indoctrination, capitalism, and patriarchy. To me, this is the more important aspect of the specific conditions of her character rather than the literal age that she might be mentally at any point in the film. The film creates a very clever and impossible device to explore philosophical questions about sexuality, pleasure, normativity, and freedom. Okay, next let's talk about the idea that the procedure is done without her consent. So it seems obvious to point this out, but I still think it's an important reminder. Yeah, duh, that's sort of the point, right? Godwin is not like a morally clean character that the audience is meant to agree with or fully relate to. He is a complicated patriarchal figure who was tortured as a child in the name of science, attempts to justify these behaviors to himself and others, and thus replicates them. Now, he attempts moral justification, but ultimately he does this for the sake of the experiment. The film's point of view is clearly that Bella has been exploited and is being taken advantage of. She also agrees with this assessment and confronts both Max and Godwin about it. The film portrays misogyny and exploitation, but it does not itself condone them. Rather, in my view, the film portrays these things explicitly to condemn and subvert them. This is a subtle but important distinction in media analysis generally, but I mean, honestly, here I don't think it's particularly subtle. So now that we've kind of gone over the viral tweet that, you know, a lot of people were dunking on and I don't think was particularly serious, but gave me a lot of good opportunities to kind of go over the themes generally in the film. Let's talk about some more serious criticisms in that they are published in real publications. There's 3 articles I want to go over and kind of pull quotes from and dissect. We'll use this as more springboards to discuss the themes of the film and really interrogate if it's this misogynist screed that it's being made out to be, right? So the first review I want to go over is one that appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle by a writer named Mick Lassell. First quote: "Worst of all, it's dishonest. It purports to be a feminist document, but it defines a woman's autonomy as the ability to be exploited and not care." Now, I personally don't see how a charitable reading of this film could possibly assert that Bella doesn't care about her exploitation. She actively escapes it as soon as she has the mental acumen to recognize it under Duncan. She negotiates terms with her clients at the brothel to make the experience more mutually satisfying, and she confronts Godwin on his abusive behavior. All the men who exploit her in the film either recognize the error of their ways after she explicitly calls them on it, or crumble and are humiliated when they are unable to continue exploiting and controlling her. Bella flips the power imbalance between her and Duncan, and even after he attempts to emotionally manipulate her to get her back, or to keep her under his control, she sees it for what it is and casts him aside. She also does the same to Alfie very quickly. Next he says, quote, "But when the movie starts tilting the scale in ways that aren't realistic, it loses its validity as social commentary. If Bella worked in a Belle Epoque brothel, she'd have been in debt. For her clothes, for her room and board, before she saw her first customer. And she'd never regain her agency. Moreover, she would almost certainly get syphilis and be physically compromised for the rest of her life." End quote. This willfully sneers past any thematic or metaphorical read of the film in favor of a pedantic literalism that obfuscates the obvious substance of these scenes. It's honestly like fucking CinemaSins tier criticism, and it's boring and it's unenlightening. I'm also not convinced that it's accurate. As the technological and medical advances portrayed in the film are kind of all over the place, it could very well be true that the standards for sexual health in this universe equal or even exceed those in the quote-unquote real world that we occupy as an audience. Next he says, quote, "The movie's thesis, that if Bella simply doesn't mind the things that another woman would mind, she can conquer men and triumph in life, is absolute nonsense for that era. But let's go so far as to accept the thesis that the path to glory can include indifference to rough sex, tantamount to rape, and a series of stinking and repulsive partners. What version of feminism are these guys, Lanthimos and screenwriter Tony McNamara, trying to sell us here? Hey man, what the fuck are you talking about? What era? The steampunk era? You got a date range on that one? My guy, she doesn't mind the things that other women would mind. The idea that she only succeeds because this misogyny she experienced doesn't bother her is both thematically and literally untrue. Throughout the film, she does set boundaries and call out bad behavior. It's not that she's not like other girls. She's not like other person, period. She has a uniquely untainted view of social norms and sexuality that no other person in her position can possibly share. Also, are we claiming that a path to glory can't include being a victim of sexual assault or having had unsavory partners? This genuinely, reeks of deeply misogynistic damaged goods rhetoric. Okay, so this next article was published in MSN. It's the same guy, Mick, but he's having a conversation with this other critic, Scott Mance, and it's literally just Scott being like, wow, dude, you were just so right, and everyone hated you and canceled you for being right. It's called, quote, "I don't like poor things, and I'm not alone." It's an entirely embarrassing article. Mick basically reiterates his argument to a critic that explicitly agrees with him. It betrays a fundamental insecurity in his opinions. You wouldn't need a second article with a peer gassing you up if you felt the article stood its ground on its merits.
It's the same spirit.
Yeah, no point. Half a point.
So in the article, Mick says, "This is the thing film critics do. If a director is established as a genuine artist, rightly so in Yorgos Lanthimos' case, the critics become intellectually intimidated and accept whatever the publicity and press releases are saying about the movie. It's much easier than thinking through what's wrong." This is just kind of entirely masturbatory and presumptuous. It really takes a lot of unearned confidence to talk about other people's opinions of a film you've so fundamentally misunderstood like this. This is just more lazy criticism, the idea that other people are just pretending to like something because it's easy or trendy, rather than accepting that you had an emotional and intellectual experience with the film that is in the minority. It really just stinks of insecurity and fragility, and it's sickeningly patronizing patronizing. It's also so obnoxious to pretend like you are some brave truth teller for having a contrarian take on a movie and then have a buddy back you up because your article wasn't convincing enough on its own, apparently. Next, Mick says, "The truth about Poor Things is right in front of people, that this is the farthest thing from a feminist film. The movie is an exploitation, not only of Bella, but of Emma Stone. The fact that Stone is being exploited willingly, and may even win an Oscar for it, doesn't ameliorate the situation. It just makes it one more chapter in a very old story." Okay, so now not only are we pretending to know the secret motivations of other critics, but of its producer and star? It's easier now in retrospect to claim that she helped create this film as a kind of cynical career move, now that it has like wildly outperformed expectations and it has won Oscars, and she did indeed win an Oscar for this performance. But I don't think any reasonable person would say that it's a safe bet to make a sexually transgressive, bizarre art film, like, for the money. It's also just so insanely condescending and the worst type of male feminist bullshit. Let me say that again. Male feminist bullshit? Jesus Christ. To tell a woman that their own decisions about what they want to do with their own bodies and how they want to tell stories is exploiting themselves. To be clear, it is possible for a woman to be wrong. This is shocking, I know. And it is even possible for a woman to cynically sell herself and all other women out for money or political expediency, see every female Republican. However, to make an accusation this severe, you have to thoroughly demonstrate how their behavior aids in their own oppression and exploitation, and then it also has to make sense. For instance, it's very easy to make the argument that explicitly anti-feminist female public figures carry water for people in movements that explicitly want to take away their rights, or that pro-life women are actively campaigning for the restriction of their and others' bodily autonomy. Claiming that starring in and producing a film about feminine sexual liberation is willingly exploiting yourself is a hazardous claim at best, and is going to require a lot of heavy lifting in your arguments. Just simply asserting it and sniffing your own farts ain't gonna cut it.
I think the thing that's been sort of challenging to me lately, there's been a lot of questions about, oh, this was a male writer and a male director. The male gaze in this situation, how does that feel? I think it takes away my agency here.
Absolutely.
Because you're completely right. I mean, all of this, I am a producer. I went into all of this. This is the story that we wanted to tell and the way we wanted to tell it.
Finally, we're going to talk about the review published in Vulture by Angelica Jade Bastian. Now, this one is at least written by a woman. It is also written quite well, and it's confident in its assertions. She didn't need to make a second article where another person is like, wow, you're so right. You know that? You're so right. And everyone hated you for it. I'll give it a lot more points for that right off the bat.
Because that last one was like,
unfortunately, to me, it also misunderstands the film in ways that make me wonder if we even saw the same thing. So first she says, quote, "Godwin frames his decision as respecting Bella's former self's wish for suicide, even though it's anything but," end quote. Yeah, Godwin, the character, does do that, but the film doesn't. At least not necessarily. This is also part of a larger character arc where, due to his flawed ideology and his abusive childhood that he has replicated, he kind of just attempts to justify his behavior. However, as Bella grows in maturity, it becomes increasingly harder for Godwin to fall into these same arguments for comfort. Whether his actions are forgivable are up for debate and largely up to Bella, but it is not unsurprising or unusual that he would attempt to square his behavior with some pseudo-ethical justification, at least until he is directly confronted on it. Also, I don't mean to be too pedantic here, but it is technically, quote, respecting Bella's former self's wish for suicide. What I mean by this is that there isn't a meaningful distinction between what he does and letting her die, at least as it relates to whether or not Victoria lives. She doesn't. We can argue whether or not respecting someone's wish for suicide is ethical, and I would say generally it isn't, unless you're talking specifically about euthanasia, but that is what he does. Victoria wanted to die, and he lets her. Next she says, quote, "In any other movie, Defoe's Godwin would be presented as grim and monstrous. Here, he is kindly and paternal, even as he refers to Bella as an experiment and flouts her autonomy. Godwin himself was subjected to experimentation by his father that left him a scarred husk of a man, unable to process food without the help of hulking machinery. This approach makes a significant effort to nullify the horrors of what Godwin has done. Defoe plays every movement and gesture as labored. He shuffles and sighs and sulks. His Godwin is less the manipulative and cruel Dr. Frankenstein figure, and more an odd and ultimately caring patriarch dubiously driven by progress. It is occurring to me right now, even though it's not in my script, that the whole point of the Dr. Frankenstein character is that he is dubiously driven by progress, but also this one stuck out to me because Godwin is quite literally presented as monstrous. His character is a combination of Victor Frankenstein's flawed ambition, or dubious drive for progress, mixed with the physical deformities of his monster. I also don't think it is particularly accurate to say that he comes across as kindly and paternal for the majority of the film. Now, he does come across as paternal to an extent, sure, as he is Bella's creator and father figure, but I don't think he is portrayed as being particularly kind. Now, of course, Bella has a complicated relationship with him. She is grateful. She explicitly says that she is grateful that he gave her the opportunity to live the life she is leading, and she clearly loves him, but she recognizes that he got there through manipulation and deception, and this angers her and makes her feel rather betrayed. Early in the film, he is quite manipulative, controlling, and patriarchal, but as the film progresses, he realizes that he cannot control her and that she has become her own person, independent of him. He clearly admires her and even explicitly disowns her as his creation because she has so actively taken a role in the forming of her own self. Now, I don't believe that the abuse that Godwin has suffered and the damage it has done to his body is there to excuse or nullify his behavior, but rather to contextualize it. People's behaviors don't come from a vacuum, and people don't decide that unethical behaviors are actually ethical apropos of nothing. Godwin was instilled from a very young age with the idea that his body, his autonomy, and his suffering was secondary to scientific progress. The only parental figure he had to model himself after was one that used him for experiments and broke his body. It is, to me, not shocking that he internalized and replicated those ideas. But that does not make those ideas right or mean that people instilled with toxic ideas are incapable of change. Poor Things and Bella Baxter choose to believe that people are not wholly good or wholly evil, and that redemption and change are possible. Now, I do agree that this is likely the most morally gray aspect of the film, and whether Godwin's reputation is earned is really ultimately up to the viewer, but I don't believe that the film asks us to accept his behavior as virtuous or justifiable, and I do think it's worth reiterating that films are allowed to be about people who do both good and bad things. Next, she says, as Bella matures, her movements shift from boldly angular to silkenly controlled, but it's all superficial machinations. We're told that she is gluttonously curious about the novel world she's traipsing through, yet most of her obsessions tilt inward. In theory, charting the way a woman becomes her own muse can be a splendid undertaking, but Poor Things makes the fatal mistake of thinking the only thing interesting to a liberated woman is herself. Her naivete is played for laughs and not introspection, so that when her baby brain evolves, it's unclear what particular intellectual and pleasure-seeking pursuits guide her beyond what Godwin and the other lurking men have encouraged. So this interpretation of her maturity is puzzling to me. Of course, at first, her obsessions skew towards her own sensations and how her body interacts with the world. However, the inciting incident in the film is literally her desire to explore the world outside of her home and outside of herself. She is soon exploring the world, making friends, and reading philosophy and debating it with said friends. One of the primary moments of maturation and understanding is achieved when she is confronted with the pointless and preventable suffering of others and wrestles with that injustice. She also interacts with plenty of women and matures based on those interactions. One of the fastest ways that she matures intellectually is when she befriends another woman when she's on the boat and devours her book recommendations, incorporating and debating the ideas that are within. Next she says, quote, that Bella's quest for self-discovery is obtained primarily through interactions, sexual and otherwise, with men is a tell. She delights in becoming a sex worker in Paris, though she only shallowly interacts with another woman employed there. End quote. Huh. Apparently, eating each other out and moving in together are shallow interactions. Who knew? Jokes aside, I mean, not really. That's not a joke. You cut that. That's literally what happens, and she's calling it shallow. I think that's funny. It's worth pointing out that sex and sex work can be liberating for many women, and it clearly is for Bella. One, it grants her the financial freedom to leave Duncan, but two, it also gives her opportunities to further learn about herself and other people. Sex can be a very intimate and valuable space for self-discovery for many people. Back to the article, she says, quote, "An obvious question lingers over it all. Is Bella carving her own path, or is she fulfilling the experiment Godwin initiated?" End quote. Now, so to give credit where it's due, I think that this is by far the most interesting point raised by the article and the closest it comes to diagnosing a problematic thematic element in the film. The question she's asking here cuts to some pretty big philosophical questions. How much can we really detach ourselves from our upbringing? Is free will an illusion? Is simply the act of living, fulfilling the will of your parents to some degree, regardless of how horrible or different from you they might be? Godwin's experiment was simply to see what would happen if a woman's child's brain was placed inside her body. In theory, there isn't really a way to avoid fulfilling this experiment. Whether she lives a fulfilling life, kills herself again, or leaves and never comes back, results are still observed. All of us are born into circumstances we didn't choose and cannot control. What happens when our desires happen to align with those who have raised us? Are we simply fulfilling a predestined outcome, or are we organically making our own choice? Bella is happy to be alive, but she resents the means by which it was made possible. Does that take away from the life she's made for herself, independent of Godwin? And partially informed by Godwin? I don't think that I or the film can claim to definitively answer these questions. The film purposefully lives in many moral and philosophical gray areas. In the end, Bella does choose to follow Godwin's footsteps as a surgeon. However, rather than simply resigning herself to a fate that shackles her freedom, this allows her to fulfill her curiosity more so than ever before. She's able to inherit the wealth and equipment that Godwin accrued and pursue the acquisition of knowledge through science, on her own terms, with people who love her. Throughout the film, the most consistent through line is Bella's quest for knowledge and discovery. She says explicitly that in the lab is when she's happiest, and what better avenue is there to pursue knowledge than as a scientist? She's able to learn from Godwin's flaws and mistakes and break the cycle of abusive behavior. Back to the article, she says, left unattended, scenes like the Paris brothel sequence play like a male fantasy, and Bella's quote-unquote furious jumping becomes aseptic rather than transgressive. These are sex scenes primed on the pleasure of others, the camera's craven gaze, the men she rides, the people who think that this is at all outre. I think I pronounced that right. The primary failure of Poor Thing's sex scenes is rooted in the decision to make Stone's character mentally a child, blasted clean of history. I want to see what a grown woman thinks and feels about sex. Show a woman with a body and brain above the age of 40 getting gloriously railed. Now, first and foremost, I want to make it explicitly clear that we here at Celeste Le Cabre Productions are very much in favor of watching women with a body and brain above the age of 40 getting gloriously railed. However, there's lots to unpack here. First, there's the accusation that the sex in the film serves the male gaze and male fantasy. In fairness, it is true that the film is directed, written, and shot by men, and it is also based on a novel written by a man. However, Emma Stone has spoken about how the film's script and ideas spoke to her and how intimately she was involved with the film's creation, particularly the film's most intimate scenes.
The male gaze in this situation, how does that feel? I think it takes away my agency here.
Absolutely.
Now, I don't believe that all of the sex scenes are primed on the pleasure of others. After she tries having sex with the men in the brothel the way they want and the way that the madam instructs her to, that being without question and entirely at their discretion, she decides it would be better for both her and the men if they both enjoyed it, and she starts incorporating her own desires and enforcing her own boundaries, like the way that they smell. She starts taking time to get to know the people beforehand and forges at least a borderline intimate connection such that the experience is more mutually pleasurable. Quote, the primary failure of Poor Thing's sex scenes is rooted in the decision to make Stone's character mentally a child blasted clean of history, unquote. To me, this again just misunderstands the trajectory of her character. This is only true for maybe the first half of the film. I just cannot understand how you can watch this film and come away thinking that she's still a child by the end of its runtime. The external and internal markers of maturation, from the change in her gait to the change in her language, demeanor, and beliefs, are all significant and all obvious. So, in conclusion, I do not believe that this film is pedophilic, anti-feminist, or misogynist. I interpret it as a bold, transgressive, and unapologetic manifesto for women's sexual and intellectual liberation. It is an intelligent, funny, colorful, luscious, emotional, imaginative, and complex narrative with superb performances, cinematography, writing, music, and production design. The film expertly lives in a space of discomfort and moral ambiguity while making its politics and its message abundantly clear. It deserves all of the praise it's gotten, and I hope you go see it. And I'm giving this one a 9 out of 10.
I think that's very inspiring.
Okay, so I hope that you enjoyed this or you got something out of it. I hope I didn't come across too mean. Again, if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more like it, we do lots of in-depth analysis on both cult and art house films, so please go ahead and click the subscribe button. If you'd like to support this channel monetarily, there are links in the description for my Patreon, channel membership, Amazon wishlist, and my P.O. box is also listed in the description. If you'd like to support this video non-monetarily, you can also leave me lovely comments to read, like the video, and share it with somebody who might find it valuable. There's also links in the description for my social media accounts, should you like to be a little bit more intimate. And remember that Satan loves all of their children. I'd like to take a moment to thank our newest patron, Stephen Perkins. I'd also like to thank our accomplices, Anthony Listro, The Boogeyman's Closet, Carlin Cook, Deanna Vave, The Disconnected, Dustin Putman, George Strang, Julie Humphris, Nosferatu 1334, Peppa Crab, and Sasha Bobashasaurus. If you'd like to be counted amongst their ranks, the link is in the description. I think that's everything I wanted to say. It's the end of my script.